So I want to first thank you for coming on behalf of the Center for the Study of Social Difference, which is the sponsor of this event this afternoon. And from the Center for the Study of Social Difference, we would like to thank all of our many sponsors who helped us bring this wonderful group of panelists together. We'd particularly like to thank the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, but we have so many people that have contributed to this, so thank you to everyone. I'm going to take a moment. My name is Paige West, and I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Barnard College. And I'm going to take a second to introduce our panelists and then to just talk a little bit about Papua New Guinea, which is a place that many of you probably have not thought a lot about. And so I'll just give a couple of framing comments. So our first presenter, who's sitting in the center, is Dr. Fiona. Sorry. Our first presenter is the first person I'm introducing. The first person I'm introducing, who is not our first presenter, is Dr. Fiona Hukula. And she's an anthropologist by training and is currently the co-program leader of the Gender Program and the leader of the Building Safer Communities program at the National Research Institute of Papua New Guinea. The next person I'll introduce is Ms. Mary Ferriero, who is a political science by training and also has a graduate degree, a graduate certificate in women's studies. She's a gender research fellow at the National Research Institute of Papua New Guinea, but previously she was at the Papua New Guinea Constitutional Law Reform Commission and has been doing research on law in the country for quite a while. And then finally, presenter-wise, is Dr. Melissa Demian, who's also an anthropologist by training and who's a senior lecturer at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Our moderator today is not me. Our moderator is Professor Sarah Nucky, who is a professor at the Columbia University School of Law and the director of the school's Human Rights Center, the law school's Human Rights Center. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to frame Papua New Guinea for you. So the island of New Guinea is the second largest island in the world. It sits directly north of the Australian continent. The western half of the island is a settler colony of Indonesia, and the eastern half of the island is Papua New Guinea, the place that we'll be hearing about this afternoon. Papua New Guinea is a parliamentary democracy that achieved independence in 1975. It has 22 provinces, one autonomous region, and the National Capital District. Papua New Guinea is a modern nation state with a GDP of about $30 billion. There are exports like coffee, cocoa, copra, and palm oil, but for the most part, it's an extraction economy. It's a resource-based extraction economy. A huge part of the extraction comes from gold and silver and copper mines, but recently oil and natural gas have become the #1 exports for the country. Papua New Guinea has about 7 million residents, and those 7 million people speak over 800 different languages, making it the most linguistically diverse place on our planet. There's a Creole language called Tok Pisin that's the language that's used by most people to communicate cross-culturally, and English is the official language of government and business. The island of New Guinea sits in a strange part of the global consciousness, and it sits in that global consciousness because in 1930, 2 gold miners walked across the center of the island and they discovered about 1 million people. Now, those people knew that they were there. Lots of other people knew that they were there, but the international media covered it as if no one knew that they were there. And think about that time period, 1930. You have the end of the colonial period in lots of other places in the world, and so Papua New Guinea, or New Guinea, got lodged in the global imaginary as one of the places where you could find the last undiscovered people. And this kind of narrative of primitivity and primitivizing of the people of Papua New Guinea has stuck with us, and so many of you will have been exposed to some of these narratives when you've looked at popular press around Papua New Guinea and New Guinea more broadly. The discipline of anthropology has something to answer for this being entrenched even in the academic study of Papua New Guinea. Many anthropologists of an older generation focused exclusively on rural villages and on the kinds of socio-cultural relationships that we might think of as happening in village-based societies. They actively refused, to acknowledge that in addition to these village-based societies, which absolutely thrive in the country, there are also very, very, very urban communities. The capital, Port Moresby, is a cosmopolitan center of the Pacific. I would argue that it's probably the most cosmopolitan city on the planet, because you think about it, 800 different languages spoken in the country, people from all of those different sociolinguistic groups living in Port Moresby, and a mix of people that are there for business and commerce and other things. But anthropology basically refused to acknowledge any of this, as did many of the other social sciences that have extracted information from the country for many years. Luckily, we have a new generation of scholars that are focusing on urban questions and contemporary problems in Papua New Guinea, and we're lucky to have 3 of those scholars here tonight. And I'll just say, I've been at Columbia for a very long time now, and this is the first time that I've had the privilege of inviting people from Papua New Guinea who are scholars to come, so thank you. And our first speaker will be Mary.
Thank you, Paige. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
So I'll be talking about my work as a practitioner in the Law Reform Commission, where I worked from last year back, for 8 years. So I'll be looking at the global mechanism of how that is being applicable in Papua New Guinea and implemented in Papua New Guinea. So asking more directly to the question of, looking at CEDAW particularly, and asking the question of, is CEDAW effectively addressing GBV in Papua New Guinea? So I'll be looking in the perspective of, discussing around the perspective of PNG government's responses and what are some challenges in the context of culture and modernity. So briefly on the outline, I'll just give a brief introduction and then the status of GBV and PNG over the last 30 years. And then I'll talk about CEDAW compliance and its application in Papua New Guinea, and then some of the challenges in terms of implementation, and finally conclusion. So I think I've just got 10 minutes, so I'll try to stick to the time. So PNG government signed the CEDAW Convention in 1995. That's about 20 years ago. And the convention is a very important international treaty that addresses all forms of discrimination against women. New Guinea, it doesn't mean that when they signed, it was the first time they wanted to address discrimination against women. There were already mechanisms that were in place that were addressing inequality for women, and one of them is the Constitution, particularly Section 55 talks about equality for all persons. However, it does not capture specific areas. And so after 1995, then in 2010 was the first report to the UN about what has been done in terms of addressing discrimination against women in Papua New Guinea. So, and one critical area that came out of that was the GBV. When the CEDAW committee responded to the CEDAW report that was submitted by Papua New Guinea, there were 2 areas that they wanted Papua New Guinea government to work on, and one area was to do with women in leadership. And the other was addressing GBV area that includes sorcery and other areas. So, like I've mentioned, I'll be discussing around the question of addressing violence against women. Is CEDAW really addressing violence against women, and what are some of the challenges in terms of this area? So, just briefly on the reports that have come out in the media. This was captured in November, and if you can see, those were consecutive reports that came out 2 consecutive days that had 4 reports in 2 different papers in the media, and that shows reported cases, but also the government's concerns in terms of addressing it, and what are the main state actors in this, like the police, and like researchers also play a critical role in trying to understand the GBV that's going on in Papua New Guinea. So the status of GBV in PNG, there was a study that was done by the Law Reform Commission in 1982 that across Papua New Guinea, the 19 provinces then, or 20 provinces, including NCD 19 provinces plus NCD 20, and they've established that domestic violence was accepted as a normal way of life or normal thing to do in a marriage. And in 1992, they did a follow-up study and found that over 60% of women were experiencing some form of violence in Papua New Guinea. Then in 2016, that's 2 years ago, 2014, the Oxfam Australia, they did a study in PNG and found over 80% of women have some experiences of violence. And then recently in 2016, the Department for Community Development, which is the department that is responsible for women's affairs, captured in the report that about two in 3 women are affected by gender-based violence in the country. So from this, we see that there's no national data to draw from, but there is individual or different data. But you can already see the picture of the widespread concerns around the gender-based violence across the country and in different levels, both urban and rural, and at different levels in the society. So GBV and PNG doesn't affect women as women in marriages only, but it also affects the girl child. So when we talk about GBV, we're also mindful of the girl child and her concerns here. So from this picture, GBV has been taken as a normal, has been normalized in different areas in Papua New Guinea, and so it raises the concern of the question of is CEDAW really addressing GBV at different levels? So what about the CEDAW, and what has the government done in terms of addressing GBV? So CEDAW is an important instrument the government has signed to, and there are certain laws that they've made in terms of addressing gender-based violence. And one key area is the lack of accessibility to justice by women. A lot of women do not access justice. For instance, like domestic violence cases, they regard it as a personal matter and they don't go to courts. They don't go and file a complaint. This time around, they try to address it through law. And one of the important law that came about in 2014 was the Family Protection Act that tries to address domestic violence. So women are given the avenue to raise their complaint and to get an interim protection order, so that they may and the husbands or partners get to be face the penalty of paying some money, or if they breach the law, then they get to be jailed for it. So there are some mechanisms created around the law, and these are the list of some of the things after 2010 the government has come about to try to review and implement some of these laws. And also touching on the policies and strategies, one important area that the government had tried to acknowledge and pass was the Sorcery National Action Plan, and also the gender-based violence strategy that is aiming towards creating this holistic approach on trying to address gender-based violence in different areas. So just not law, but also education and health and in different areas. So the big question that I'm asking here is the law effective in its implementation? We can have all these laws. So this is just a picture of one of our consultation that we took out to one of the provinces in the country, Goroka. And we've consulted with the people on the ground, like the stakeholders, and it was open to the public to come and tell us what or how is the existing law, are they able to use the existing law, and what are the issues around the law itself at their level, and how best can we recommend some recommendations around addressing the issues of GBV. So CEDAW compliance, we went out to talk about Marriage Act and Matrimonial Causes Act, and how the people on the ground would be able to tell us about the issues around that area, because we're at the national level. We don't know a lot of things that happen on the ground, so we go out to do that. And this is just one of the pictures that shows our engagement with the people on the ground as stakeholders and the public. So the big question is, are the laws effective? We can make all these laws, but are they effective in terms of its implementation? Now, it is one thing to make laws and another to implement them effectively. So we do integrate all these laws, but when it comes to implementation, that's the question. A scenario is about the domestic violence issues. So when an issue arises and when a domestic violence incident happened at home and the neighbors call the police, or the children or somebody in the house call the police says, I do not have fuel in my vehicle, I can't come. So then it questions the effectiveness of this law. Is it being implemented effectively? Another challenge is the issue about private versus the public matter. So, because most of the gender-based violence is looking at the issues that are happening within the family, and so many people want to resolve it within the family, and they say, look, this is my family, and it's a private matter. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to take it out. Let me deal with it. Women, on the other hand, are being disadvantaged because they do not speak up in terms of trying to hear the concerns or go to the police. And one thing that is contributing to this is the disconnection between the national level and the community level, where people are not aware of the law changes. So when we go around talking to people about, are you aware of this and what do you think about this existing law, and we're trying to do this amendment, so what are your thoughts on it? They said, I'm not sure about this law, what does it talk about? And Family Protection Act, what is it? It's new. How do I go about in helping myself if I am caught up in the situation? So many people are still regarding domestic violence as a personal matter, but it's already a social concern, and so it's a public matter now, given that there's already a law for it, and they should come forward. So that's another challenge that the law area is facing. Another one is compensation. We went for this forum, and the magistrate said that there was a case to do with a rape case, and the perpetrator's family offered some money to the family of the survivor, and they accepted it. So in this way, the young teenage girl could not seek justice because it's already being settled through compensation outside of the justice system, and that's a challenge in the law area as well. And then we have Papua New Guinea is very much defined as a communal society in many ways. So a lot of things are agreed through the community and the tribe. So things like sorcery issue, a lot of incidences that happen around the community gathering together and torturing a woman or a man, and it's based on the communalism concept. And so this restricts or this hinders on the right of the woman to be free from all this violence and expressing herself, because the communal is surrounding her, so she does not exercise that right to be free. So these are some things that we tend to encounter when we talk to the people, like how best can we make laws so that we could understand, or it could be more applicable in the context of the society, in different ways. Like Paige has explained, there's so many languages that define our culture and the differences. And then there's the role of the justice system, particularly looking at the community level. The village court particularly is caught between weighing out the customs as well as the common law and which one to apply. So sometimes this is a challenge for the legal system, and compensation comes in, and so it kind of affects how they do the decisions. So, and then we have other mechanisms, churches and the media's role. Very recently, media has been coming out strong, but also churches' role is important. In this context, they're supposed to play a neutral mechanism, and we had a conference with the churches, and we asked them about what are some of the mechanisms that you have in terms of addressing social-related violence, and many of them did not have a comprehensive or active approach. They only talk about the Bible and what the Bible says. I think only the Catholic Church has a comprehensive active approach in providing safe houses and repatriation for the survivors of sorcery violence. So these are some of the challenges that the law is facing in terms of working along with the other mechanisms, but also in terms of implementation that comes in clash with the customs that are on the ground. And also awareness and knowing about these laws are one of the challenges that people are still lacking. So finally, I'm on my last page. So from our research, from my research and my work as a practitioner in the Law Reform Commission and now with NRI, GBV is a complex issue, and it has a lot of dimensions to it. So, like the emphasis now is on a holistic approach where the law only cannot address this issue. They have to involve other mechanisms as well, such as education, such as health that come in. And then there's the customs, understanding, and engaging the leaders at the community level, because they are the ones that interact with the people in the community. So law can be a solution, but it's not the only answer. More needs to be done in other areas as well, and effective communication is one of them. Creating the link between the government and the people in the community at the local level. but also particularly the enforcement of these laws that we need to strengthen. And all of this comes down to support. Support is really lacking in terms of providing the technical and financial support to implement these laws effectively in the community. So going back to my big question about the effectiveness of CEDAW, we can tick the boxes in terms of, yes, we have these mechanisms and laws, but the big question is, are they effective? Are they actually addressing the gender-based violence in the country? So we need to think about creating this, so when we are working, we think about how do we engage everyone to be involved so they play a role in terms of addressing GBV in the area, the churches, the media, increasingly the media just recently, and then the other actors like other stakeholders, so that when we do implement them, we can truly say that we have made a difference in the society in terms of law only, but also in other areas. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the role of village courts in addressing gender-based violence. So I've been working in this area since I was a PhD student. In Papua New Guinea and especially in Port Moresby, you see groups of people gathering around, and if you're not familiar, you think it's a tribal meeting going on. That's village courts. They're sitting under trees where you see a Papua New Guinea flag, and they're convening village courts or committee meetings, which are sort of the next level. So today I want to talk a bit about their role in addressing GBV. And the reason why, so I've just got that little outline there. So the reason why I focus my research on village courts, especially for the last 4 or so years, is because they're a mechanism within Papua New Guinea that's sort of everywhere. There's around 16,000 village court officials, over 1,000 village courts in Papua New Guinea. And so where the police, Mary talked in terms of the role of law and law enforcement, we've had a lot of focus on the police. So we've established family and sexual violence units there's about 20 in the provinces in Papua New Guinea, and they're supposed to be kind of the first response. But I strongly argue that these people at the village court level are really the first response. They've been doing this for many, many years now. And this is because of the lack of accessibility to legal mechanisms like the police. So in many places, the village court is really the only sort of arm of the government in the community. And also because we're, as Mary said, a communal society, many people opt for informal mediation, and under the Village Court Act, they can mediate disputes. So this is from some recent work. So lately with the village courts, I've been doing 2 sets of work. One is looking at the ways in which they deal with family violence or intimate partner violence. So I conducted 4 research workshops in 4 provinces at the end of last year. So this is in Eastern Highlands. It's Asarayufa, which is a village just on the edge of Goroka town. This is a court proceeding. So that's a courthouse you can see there. But because there's so many people, they're having another court session outside. So I'll just show you that picture. And this is my local village court in my community in Port Moresby. And this is where I really started getting interested in the work they do around GBV and domestic violence. If you see here, there's the court officials are sitting where the table is, and then there's a couple who are there who have brought a case to court. A woman has brought her husband to court for domestic violence. So the village courts in Papua New Guinea, they operate under the Village Court Act, and they have regulations. They're supposed to deal with petty kind of issues, so, stealing, assault, insult. But in reality, they deal with a lot of things. So I mentioned that I had a first project that I worked on looking at the way in which they deal with domestic violence. And this is directly related to how we can inform the rollout of our PNG national strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, because that is a holistic kind of strategy that's come up that has been worked on and endorsed by the government and needs to be addressed at all levels, and also through the Family Protection Act of 2013, which kind of puts mediation as a key in that act, but it doesn't include the village courts in terms of mediation. But that's a key thing that they do, and they have been doing for many years. In terms of the rollout of the Family Protection Act, the village courts can only give interim protection orders, and they have also in their regulations are able to give preventive orders, and they do that for many domestic violence cases. And I've observed many cases, and most of the cases that come to village courts are related to domestic violence or violence of some sort between men and women. And so that's where I think the work that I do also shows that while we have a perception that it is a kind of a private matter, in some ways it's not really private, because as you can see here, this is at the back of a local market. So when the court sits, anybody can go and sit and listen. Most times it's people from your own community, so you know each other, and people sit there and say, I mean, this guy did that to that lady, and that shame factor is in there as well. And the local village court magistrates, the clerk, the peace officers, they're all people that are local to that particular community. In terms of the working with village courts, they've now sort of moved into trying to work in that court system. So they're like the last layer of the first layer of the court system, and they have issues and challenges around understanding legislation changes, such as the Family Protection Act. So they're not really sure where they fit in, because they do preventive orders, but then they hear that under the FPA they can do this IPO thing, so they're like, okay, so where does that override our preventive order? Because we've been giving preventive orders all the time when men and women come to court for their dispute concerns. Some of the challenges also include trying to incorporate and also understand rights-based language and how this works with communal concerns. So, as Mary mentioned, a lot of disputes are also discussed with members of families, tribe, community. For example, if a couple come to the court and want to have a traditional marriage, in Pidgin we say brukimarit. So they come and say, the wife says, look, I've had enough of this guy because he's got so many other wives, or he beats me up all the time, I'm done, I want to get this over and done with. The village courts, because they follow custom, often ask for family members to come and also discuss about whether bride price was paid, whether any exchanges happened, about children, because these are all very key to kinship and family relations in PNG. I've seen that in the urban context, they're a bit more relaxed, because urban marriages sometimes don't have that family support, in terms of they might have got married in their province and then they've come to the city, so they can't exactly bring their relatives to come and say, yeah, we got 1 or 2 pigs from here or there. So in the research that I've done, I've seen that the fact that village court officials are actually local to the community, it can work for and against gender-based violence sort of cases for women, because they can strongly get up, and I've seen this, sort of say, okay, this is it. We know that this woman is a repeat victim of violence, and we're going to sort of break this marriage now without any other discussions. Or the discussions can go on and on and on, because they know the kinship relations and the relations between the the two parties. And I just really, I want to share this here. This is the highlighted bit is a challenge from a village court that was sharing some of their challenges in trying to address domestic violence. And they said, 1M right M, women right M, 1M, women's rights. So they said, they asked me this. They said they weren't sure. They were quite aware of a number of international NGOs in their town, like Oxfam and Save the Children, and they had a fair idea of what they did. One of the things I did with this research project was to also ask them about what they understood to be referral pathways, because this is how we're moving at the national policy level. And in this particular province, because they have a lot of international NGOs, some of them were quite clear. They said, oh, we refer some of these women to Cafe Women's Association or Oxfam, and they knew clearly. But they were just not sure about what this women's right talk was. And the interesting thing was, after I did this workshop, one village court actually invited me to go and watch a court proceeding. And so I observed about 3 court sittings. They were all domestic violence related, and every single one of them, the magistrates made ruling in favor of the women. So I wasn't sure whether it was because I was there, but I think in a lot of the village court sittings that I've observed, they have ruled for women, especially in terms of women who have been abused or left to their own sort of to fend for themselves, and their husbands have gone off to marry other women. So I thought that this was something that's really key, and that when we're trying to address gender-based violence, and we talk at that very high level national kind of forum, the things that Mary mentioned, we need to also be mindful that we've got all these people on the ground who are also dealing with this issue in their own way. And even though they might not be doing women's rights or human rights in a way that is framed in those kind of international terms that we've taken on, they are in their own way still working at it. And I think those are the things that for us in Papua New Guinea, we need to build on that, not just in terms of domestic violence, but with the big problem that we have with sorcery accusation related violence. And I'm working on a research project at the moment that is looking at local mechanisms to address sorcery accusation. So we've got a big problem in our country, but it's not everywhere. So in some provinces, sorcery accusation does end in violence, but not in all provinces. And so I've got a project, as I mentioned, that works there and specifically looks at the work of the village courts and other people on the ground, such as human rights defenders or community mediators and leaders, because a lot of the times these people wear a lot of different hats. So they can be the village court magistrate and also the pastor or some other clan leader. So really, I think I'll stop because I can go on. And you know, in anthropology, we like to sort of talk about the people that we work with. And I believe, even though there's a lot of criticism, you know, academically, also in practice, and in terms of the work that the village court does, I think that there's still a very important group of people that we need to focus on and try to get this agenda of trying to address various forms of GBV into the work that they do. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think what, since I'm so grateful to Fiona for having talked about the village courts so that I don't have to, although you'll see them in just a couple of slides. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to kind of zoom out from the law a bit. What I've found in recent research in the last sort of year and a half on domestic violence in Papua New Guinea's two main cities, mostly Lae. This is the second city of Papua New Guinea. It's sort of the economic engine room of the country on the north coast. To my great surprise and dismay, as somebody who's been calling herself a legal anthropologist for about 18 years, is that the more I talked to women who had survived domestic violence and were trying to figure out what to do next, is how few of them were interested in a legal solution, which was very disconcerting for me. And I generally open talking about this research by invoking Zwabe. This is my co-researcher on this project. It would not have been possible without her. And I wish, every time I present it, I wish she were here presenting it with me. So this is how we worked. We were trying to find women who would talk to us in settings that they were comfortable with, and most often this meant at their church. It was neither their home nor the marketplace, the former being a little too connected with the violence itself, the latter being a little too public. So church was most often the safe space where they were able to talk. And what we were doing, I felt, at the same time as we were talking to women about their experiences of domestic violence, was that we were talking to them about their experiences of being women in the city, and this is significant. Papua New Guinea's cities are all colonial artifacts. They might have started out as mission stations, which Port Moresby did. They might have started out as gold rush towns, like Lae did. Or they all began as mission stations, trading stations, and then they grew organically in the way that cities did, except that because, as Paige mentioned, Papua New Guinea was sort of late to the colonial game and late leaving it, as it only became independent in 1975. And right up until the late 1960s, I think it is worth mentioning that the Australian colonial administration operated in most of the cities and towns a system that in sub-Saharan Africa would have been called a color bar, or would have been called Jim Crow here in the United States. Papua New Guineans were not meant to live in these cities. They were not meant to work in these cities. And in particular, Papua New Guinean women were not supposed to be in these cities at all. What Papua New Guinean labor force there was prior to independence was envisioned by the colonial authorities as single and male and brief, right? You were meant to come and work for a few years and then go home to your village where Papua New Guineans belonged and, pay your bride wealth with whatever you'd earned in town. And so I think there's, as I become more and more interested in kind of the urban geography of PNG, having worked in its villages for a very, very long time, and kind of how the lawscape and the landscape and the cityscape are all interacting, particularly for women who are still finding their way as people who are trying to figure out how to make the city work for them and not just be a place that they've been dragged into. And one of the ways that they do this is by congregating around what I like to call efficacious personalities. You can see at the back of this photograph, obscured by the flag in her friend's hair, a woman called Esther. She's a village court magistrate, and as Fiona mentioned, a lot of village court magistrates wear multiple hats, literally or figuratively or literally in this case, where they have a lot of roles that they can kind of assume and put to the side and assume and put to the side to try to make something happen in their communities. And Esther, like a lot of the female village court magistrates that I spoke to, was really interested not just in trying to find to kind of dispense legal solutions for the women who came to her court sittings, but to try to figure out how to make something bigger happen. And a lot of women voiced to Zwabe and myself their frustration with being unable to kind of get something started. Again, during the colonial era, what few jobs were given to Papua New Guineans were given to Papua New Guinean men. There is no really deep historical model for women working, now they do, right? Or starting their own businesses or running anything apart from women's fellowship groups and churches. And so I definitely had the impression that a lot of the women who were trying to find kind of a long-term solution for themselves to earn the respect of their husbands, this is how they put it. If I am earning money, he can't treat me like that. Yeah? And that was the kind of justice that they were looking for. Some went to court, for sure, but I think the women who actually take domestic violence issues to court is the tip of the iceberg compared to the actual cases that are out there. And if they do go to court, again, they are dependent on an efficacious personality being there who will kind of personally take up their case. The magistrate sitting in the middle here at this court sitting was renowned for personally escorting women to the police, to the hospital, to a safe house. Sometimes she made her own house the safe house at great personal risk to herself and her family, because irate husbands would come in the middle of the night threatening to kill everybody, burn the house down, you name it. And there's a tremendous amount of grassroots support for women who know how to look for it. And when I say grassroots, I mean both in the sense of it's kind of informally happening, it's a bit organic, but also in the Papua New Guinean sense of it's ordinary people doing this. It's not the NGOs. It's not the kind of formal actors in the formal legal system. It's certainly not the police. If you're going to get any help, you're going to get it by finding somebody who can actually help you personally. And it's all these kind of very hard to see relationships unless you are talking to people over and over again. Who did you go to for help? What did they do for you? What did they do for you next? That's the referral pathway that's actually working, but is very, very hard to capture with statistics. And so what's happening instead, again, as Fiona said, is a lot of people trying to kind of sort out their problems for themselves. This was at an informal mediation in another settlement in Leh, and where a young couple who had been experiencing all kinds of problems, some of which would fall under the rubric of domestic violence, some of which wouldn't, were kind of trying to make things right with each other. And I think, again, when we talk about something like domestic violence, it is not, we talk about it as if it's a thing that just happens unattached to anything else. And of course, that's never how it works. It's attached to people's expectations of what a marriage is. It's attached to people's economic expectations. And again, we're talking about urban environments with very rapidly growing populations, very youthful populations, and very, very few employment opportunities. And they are also sprawling out into customary land, not alienated land. You can't buy and sell it. And so settlements like this one, everybody living on it is usually in an informal rent agreement with the customary landowner to live there. But this means that there is, in addition to the growing wealth inequality in the country as a result of its recent resource boom, you also have this sort of landlord class growing up around the cities because the customary landlord happens to be in the right place at the right time, and a very, very large, again, growing kind of tenant class of people who are trying to make a life in the city for their families with very, very few means of doing so, and no land of their own, and very, very few opportunities for acquiring land. I want to, I guess, conclude with a very powerful statement that was offered to me by a staff member at a very small NGO in Leh that tried to kind of support grassroots organizations. These tend to be kind of short-lived in PNG. A lot of organization, again, kind of organization of people not with their families, right? People who are not related in any way, trying to make something happen together. Again, it's a relatively recent phenomenon in PNG. Again, it usually is organized around churches, and so this little local NGO called Melanesian Organizational Development was established to try to, with the support of the Lutheran Church, try to support little business organizations, little cooperatives, little local markets and they had these, very, very, very good rules to sort of impose on the organizations that they were helping to try to get them to work with each other instead of looking to a government that really just isn't interested for support. And she said, now, Melissa, she said, I know you worked in Milne Bay before. This is a province of Papua New Guinea that very unusually has matrilineal inheritance of land. Most of the country doesn't work that way. Now, Melissa, I know you worked in Milne Bay before, but you see here in the rest of Papua New Guinea, land goes through the father, and that means that men are blocking women from the land. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, the vine can only, grow up if it's supported by the tree. And, women can't do anything if their brothers and husbands aren't supporting them. And instead what's happening is that women aren't able to do what they want to do because they don't have the authority over the land. Now, she was offering a spiritual account of what I might call an economic issue or what I might call a political issue. But if you're going to do anthropology properly, you have to pay attention to how people are saying, like, this is how gender asymmetry works here. All right, are you listening? Right? Because the NGO narratives that are continually dropped on Papua New Guinea are all about this rights talk, right? That if you just add rights, everything's going to be fine. But it isn't going to work. These kind of rights-based initiatives aren't going to work. They're going to continue to fail, and they do fail over and over again. Either the rights talk is actively rejected by men, or there's this kind of querying of, well, what does that even mean? And what a Papua New Guinean kind of gender equality initiative would look like would have to be linked somehow to the notion that people are using the land together, and they're using it in ways that they never envisioned before these cities happened, and they're connecting with people that they are ethnically unrelated to. They're connecting with people from different churches, and how you would make a life that women and their families can that would actually flourish, that would actually allow them to do the kinds of things that they would like to do, regardless of what is happening in their homes or not, is absolutely dependent on their ability to make connections in the space of the city in ways that allow them to have some kind of voice in how their households are run and how their settlements are run and in how the city itself is growing. And I will stop there.
And we're going to open it up to everyone, and there's so many people here from disciplines all across the university that will be able to have a rich, multidisciplinary conversation. But before we do, I wanted to kick it off with a few questions for you. I'll ask two together, and you can pick from them whichever part is interesting for you. A law question, and then a question about how non-Papua New Guineans talk about these issues. The law question is, you've all discussed different legal regimes at different levels, village level, national level, and the international level. And I'd love to invite you to say more about how you see in your research people conceiving of their relationship to the different regimes, especially the national and the international. Do people think about each of them in the similar kind of way as being very distant or difficult to pull down to the ground and implement, or are they thinking about the international very differently than how they think about the laws coming from national parliament? And the how do foreigners talk about these issues question, there's not a lot of foreign press about Papua New Guinea to the extent that it's covered in newspapers. It's mostly Aussie journalists, and they either write about beautiful birds or they write pieces about the violence. And much of the journalism in graphic detail explains the violence of a sorcery attack or a tribal fight. And it's very difficult to find accounts of those issues that aren't either explicitly racist or reifying notions of the Australians' historical relationship to Papua New Guinea. But it's not only the journalism if you look at work in the international human rights field, even work that is openly well-intentioned about advancing rights, especially the work on sorcery, it's hard to read it and not feel very uncomfortable with what seems like a fascination with extreme or exotic violence that's unfamiliar to the authors of the report that's coming out of the UN or an NGO based in Europe or the US. So I'd love your views first about how you see foreign writing about violence in Papua New Guinea. And if you have guidance for us, most of us are not living in or from Papua New Guinea, about how we should best and responsibly relate to the very real issues of violence, but to talk about them in a way that doesn't further cultural and racist stereotypes about Papua New Guinea. That was the two. Take from it whatever is interesting for you.
Well, I certainly think that a lot of the foreign writing about Papua New Guinea definitely portrays what you have just mentioned. And in terms of sorcery, accusation-related violence, that narrative of us being barbaric and sort of way back, and in the 16th century they were burning witches in England or Scotland, where I did my PhD, you know, that comparison. And some of that writing about sorcery accusation doesn't reflect those deep kind of challenges that Papua New Guinean people have in terms of the duality of our social lives, the world that we live in. We were having this discussion just before the before this event about the narrative is that it's uneducated people who are living in the backwaters of Enga or some place like that who have had a very limited education and who can't sort of make that distinction between sort of that narrative of, because they're uneducated, they don't understand about the consequences of certain illnesses and things like that, which is very, very true. I don't dispute that, but I also think that we don't take into account enough that, and this is not just foreign sort of people who write about, foreign journalists, but I think in our country ourselves, us as Papua New Guinean so-called educated elite, we turn to say, okay, they're all these primitive Bush Kanaka people who can't think outside of anything else because they don't have an education. But we also see that there are people who have tertiary education, people who have lived overseas, who still believe in other cosmological ways of thinking about the world and illness. And so this is where, in terms of sorcery, we need to address it at that very, sort of address it all. Because we need to have some legal response to say, so that people know that, look, you cannot do this, you can't accuse someone and then take their life or cut them or burn them. But we also have to be mindful that, that the world that we live in also is regardless, I think, of levels of education, we live in that kind of dual, we've got our feet in both worlds, and that also really informs the way we think about a lot of things, not just sorcery accusation or domestic or intimate partner violence. Thanks.
So through my work, I've learned some things about perceptions of people on the ground and how international, like readings from international writers have perceived. Sometimes I feel that it's being generalized in a lot of places, and it's not, because through my work with other people on the ground, there are differences in how people deal with the issues on the ground, and may not necessarily be the same because we have different cultures and customs. And one factor that is happening in Papua New Guinea, the intermarriages have breached a lot of customs, and they've come together to try to compromise some of the customs that they have. And sometimes I feel that the readings are just being biased of trying to generalize what is being happening in the country. And I feel that they lack this connection of what is actually happening in the communities, because a lot is actually happening. When we do talk to people on the ground, we see that they have their own mechanisms of how they want to address a particular issue in terms of violence, but sometimes it's perceived differently from the outside. I think just going on from that, in terms of CEDAW, there's a disconnection in how people understand what really is CEDAW all about. Like, we've asked the people and they said, what is that supposed to be? And we're like, oh no, it's about protecting the women and promoting women's rights to things like accessibility, to get from violence and all that. And they're like, okay, so what are some of the places that we need to go to? What do we need to do? And what does it say? And, all these questions about, or they lack that knowledge of understanding what it is. And we're trying so hard to explain to them in the language that, like, what we are reading from the international text. But sometimes we try harder to translate it in our language so that they do understand. And that's one of the challenges that we face in trying to translate it in a way that could be understood at their level. But again, that's the differences within or between different provinces. So the Highlanders might understand violence against women differently to people in the coastal area. So that's one thing that we need to be mindful of. And then people who migrate here and there, they kind of take on other people's cultures and trying to solve the issues among different cultures and compromise somewhere. Those are just some of the things.
I'll take up the legal question. So I've spent about 18 years trying to work out how the different levels of the Papua New Guinean legal system are interacting, and to steal a line from my favorite novel growing up, the further in you go, the bigger it gets. Because when you think you're working at a particular level, as in a particular place in a legal hierarchy, and I'm sure it's not only PNG where this happens, but that's the legal system I know best. You constantly got the other levels not above or below you, but they're operating in the background. So it's really, rather than levels, it's kind of something's foregrounded, something's backgrounded. And so I might be at a village court sitting on a beach in the middle of nowhere, and people are talking about national laws, the national court can be dragged kicking and screaming into taking up a case that has to do with customary law, which is enshrined in the Papua New Guinean Constitution, but it is left undefined. And this has been kind of a legal dilemma in the country ever since, because it can only be dealt with through case law. So I think as Mary's work has underlined really importantly, is there's all these laws being made at the national level because the country. Papua New Guinean legislators know that they have obligations under international law. They know they have obligations under treaties that they've signed, and they're not just being cynical. There are legislators who genuinely want to enact laws that they see as being for the good of the country. Now the problem is that just as we all know, just enacting a law doesn't magically change everybody's behavior overnight, but there's this kind of uncomfortable discourse in the country at the moment, at least that I was running into on the domestic violence research, that we've got the law in place, why aren't people paying attention? You can't beat your wife anymore, it's now illegal. And it doesn't work like that. Laws change everywhere, and they can't just drag society along behind them. And just having the law in place won't fix things. And so I think, as the work that Mary's doing at the NRI is demonstrating that the national conversation about law says something about how Papua New Guineans want to think about how their society is changing, but law is one language that you can talk about that with, and there is sometimes a risk of silencing other ways of talking about it if you are only talking about it in terms of the legal.
Well, open it up to everyone else. Take questions in pairs. If you could say a few words of introduction as you ask your question.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. So I had a question about the village courts, and I'm just wondering who gets to be these mediators. So I'm wondering how court magistrates come to be court magistrates, and whether it's a civic obligation, like, I don't know, from Mexico, and in customary law, like being part of the assembly is an obligation, like you can't get out of it, just like jury duty is here, or whether it's a right that you earn, like through like a position in the social world or whatever. So I'm interested in who gets to be that mediator. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Thank you again so much for coming. This has been a really illuminating panel. I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more to sort of the influence and impact of foreign companies on gender-based violence, especially outside of the context. Obviously, there's, as you've all talked about, sort of cultural norms, but outside of that, the disruption and cultural disruption that comes from especially extractive companies in Papua New Guinea.
So I'll start with the courts question. So the village courts, there's an act which that guides the work of the village court. And village court officials are people who are leaders in their community. So they are either a church leader or a leader of their clan, and they're appointed by the government. One of the criticisms of village courts, because they have been in place before Papua New Guinea became independent in 1975, was that it was only, it was a male-dominated organization. The village courts were all men. So when there was the recent amendments to the act requires one woman to be a magistrate. And so I think in terms of research, that would be really interesting for us to see what the role of these women are in terms of how GBV cases are being sort of handled at that village court level, because in the courts that I've worked in, there's some very strong female women village court magistrates who are very firm when this issue comes about. But that's coming back to your question. They are appointed by the government. They are usually leaders and who are recognized in their communities. And I think this is really key, especially in urban centers, because I have been at my local village court, which is at the back of a market, and I have seen people fighting and carrying on, and I've seen the village court at work in terms of the way they can diffuse quite tense situations. And so the quality or the caliber of people who are village court magistrates are really, really important in terms of trying to address community disputes.
Can I add something to that? There is this figure that Fiona cited of 16,000 village court officials. Those are the ones who are gazetted, as in they are known to the village court secretariat in Port Moresby. An interesting phenomenon that I've been kind of, not very rigorously documenting, but paying attention to in the last few years is the proliferation of village court magistrates who don't appear on any list anywhere. This system is so popular across Papua New Guinea as a way of managing disputes through mediation or adjudication that communities are appointing their own village court magistrates that they're not gazetted, they're not paid, they're not trained, which you might or might not see as a problem. The communities don't. It's like, right, these are our respected people. You, you're going to be our village court magistrates, and you're going to hold a hearing every fortnight or whatever. And the village court secretariat may have no knowledge of this whatsoever, but it is something that is operating as a court, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, in Tokpisin they call it committee.
Yeah.
So they're the next level down. And as Melissa said, they're not gazetted, but they're people who do informal mediation within their communities, sometimes with or without the knowledge of the gazetted village court officials.
Extractives? You don't want to do it? I'm not opening it. Extractive industry. Really?
Well, just to, I'm not really, the extractive is not something that I've really focused research on, but I can, and I mentioned that, in terms of the extractive industry, there has been considerable issues around GBV in terms of some of the social issues that come with having money and men who have money, and that's related to other issues such as HIV, because benefit sharing often doesn't get down to women, and we have a lot of landowners who come and camp in Port Moresby to get their benefits, and they spend that money there, and people don't, the people in the villages, the wives and the children don't necessarily benefit from that resource. Also there's issues around, and this came up in Porgera, the sexual kind of violence that happens in terms of women who are sexually abused by company security or in that space. So I think in general extractive industries across in PNG has been quite disruptive for not only women but for lots of communities in general.
I'd just add to that again, this is not something I've researched, but just something that I've noticed over the years, which is that the foreign companies are following the old colonial patterns of hiring almost entirely male staff, and for every one woman that a mining company or whatever hires, they've hired 40 men, and so economic opportunities also are not. It's nothing even remotely close to a level playing field.
Thank you very much for this panel. I'd like to ask about a potential gap between the communal norms that are used to mediate disputes in the village court and this rights-based language that's coming from the center. How big is that gap? And is there a penetration of this new language that really takes hold in these village courts, or is there an attempt to hang on to a way of understanding these problems and adjudicating them that is somehow outside of that new language, which you've described in part as a rights language?
We've just got a few minutes left, actually, so we could take one more question and then you could answer the two together. Kendall.
Thanks so much for coming. I'd actually like to ask a question about sorcery and get your thoughts on how we ought to think of the violence directed at people. I'm assuming it's mostly women, or disproportionately women, who are accused of sorcery. What's a gender-based violence framework for understanding that violence? And is it the best framework? Are there other factors in play that, in addition to, or perhaps in lieu of, gender-based violence, offer us a better explanatory or analytic framework?
So in terms of the gap, I think in the research that I do, I can see the difference, but it's not a difference that can be generalized in that in some, for example, the work that I did with the village courts recently, there's some provinces like the Eastern Highlands and the East Sepik where I think there has been a very strong NGO kind of movement where rights-based language was used, in the workshops by these village court officials. So the way in which the workshop was run was that didn't say anything about anything. I just said to them, what do you guys do in terms of addressing domestic violence cases as per your act? What do you know about, what are the pathways? Who do you go and send your, refer your people to, things like that. And as I mentioned, in Eastern Highlands and East Sepik, some of the village court clearly named NGOs that work in that space and use that rights-based kind of language. And these are NGOs that have supported their local NGOs, Papua New Guinean homegrown NGOs that are supported by international NGOs like Oxfam. So you could see that it's there. And as I mentioned, you know, the talk about rights, even though they were saying, oh, we're not so sure about this and what's this human rights and women's rights, they were talking about rights, but in their own way, in the way in which they kind of understood it. And so it's not that while it's in a lot of sort of arguments and debates seen as a foreign concept, it's also taken root along the way, because women's activism and the issue of gender-based violence is one that has been on the radar for Papua New Guinea for many, many years. So I think it's a bit of both. There is a gap, you can see, but you can't generalize across the whole country. There are places where local action is very, very firm. And we can see that in sorcery-related activism for sorcery accusation-based violence.
Yeah, just sharing my experience. I've also experienced that in other places, like in the Highlands, in Goroka. The photo that I showed earlier, that had a lot of NGO groups coming in, attending, and they had a lot of, they played a lot of leadership role in terms of trying to get the message across to the people at the village level. And I think Goroka is one place where there's a lot of NGOs who's been supported by the international organizations that are running NGOs in that area. So a lot of people there, they have this relationship with the NGOs, and they let them kind of like lead them. So when we asked them, like, what is your opinion, what do you experience, like your experiences of violence in your village? And they said, oh yes, you know, we work with this NGO, and they come in and they help us do awareness, and this is what we know, and this is you know, so they basically refer to NGOs as the one that is connecting with them. So I would agree that there's the gap, but it's slowly like through work of the NGOs it's working, but not the government. Government, there's still the big connection because of the work that I do. I see that a lot of people still do not understand how the important role that the government play in trying to tell them about the existing law, and why it's important to amend the laws so that we could address issues like violence against women.
It's also important to remember that communal norms change over time. So in the 20 years of my acquaintance with a particular rural population in southeastern Papua New Guinea, just in those 20 years, I've noticed a real shift in how young women are thinking about marriage. I've become really obsessed with marriage in this work, which is quite funny. It's not something I've ever thought of for myself or anybody else. But women are really, really interested in what marriage is now and what it can offer them. And if it doesn't offer them anything, well, maybe they're just not going to do it. And it's really striking to me how in the space of 20 years, marriage has gone from something that is compulsory, you know, this is what you do to keep your lineage going, and this is, you know, all those social reproduction things that anthropologists love to think about. And now it seems to be an open question, you know, will I get married? Do I have to get married in a particular way? If I do get married, do I have to be put up with being mistreated, that has changed in just 20 years. And so, and I think we're seeing it in all these domestic violence cases that are going to court for the women who do want a legal solution. You know, actually I don't have to take it anymore, and I'm going to, at a minimum, make a public spectacle of a husband whose expectations of the marriage were clearly different from mine. and maximally get the marriage dissolved because this is not working out for me. So that's quite interesting. Norms do change. And people, whether or not they're taking on board rights-based languages, they are taking on board a sense of themselves as having interests that they can pursue and defend. And I'm afraid to talk about sorcery.
We'll continue all of that, perhaps one-on-one or in smaller groups after, but please join me in thanking our guests very much.